Thank you everyone for staying after. Feel free to come closer. And I guess I'll just jump right into it. Okay. Hey everyone, my name is Lauren Costantino. I cover religion for the Miami Herald, and I'm joined here today with three lovely, intelligent, wonderful panelists. I have Reverend Paul Raushenbush to the far right over here, who's the president and CEO of Interfaith Alliance. Hi, Paul. Joined by Rabbi Jamie Aklepi from Temple Beth Am. Hi, Rabbi. And Josh Sayles, who is the Director of Jewish Community and Government Relations for the Greater Miami Jewish Federation. Hey, Josh. All right, well, I have some questions, and then we're going to allow the audience here to ask some questions towards the end. So just stick around if you have questions that come up for you. So we just saw in this powerful film over and over again this theme of how tragedy can bring us together. We saw marginalized groups in Pittsburgh, Black people, Muslim, immigrant communities who kind of stepped up and stood by each other in the wake of tragedy. And I'm wondering, and this question is kind of for anyone who wants to take it, how do we sustain this momentum, this sort of, desire to build a more unified country, to fight against hate that, always comes up right after the wake of tragedy? And, I'm asking this question, especially now here in Miami and all over the world when, Jews are still reeling from the heartbreak of October 7th. So how do we sustain this momentum? Does anyone want to take that?
I have the mic, so I'll start.
Okay.
We have to maintain and keep nurturing the relationships that may happen after a tragedy. And I think one of the beautiful things of the film is that it really brought the point home that there's a vulnerability and even a danger in opening up and sharing how you feel and getting to know another person who you wouldn't have a relationship with. But without building those relationships, you stand alone. When the high school students had that vigil that few hours later, the answer was they didn't want anybody to feel alone. And I think that that's what we try to do. We have an initiative now at a synagogue called Unbiased, where we try to end anti-Semitism and hatred, and because it's a constant push, constant nudge, constant work.
Thank you for that.
I'll give you two answers. So just to share with the audience that I was in Pittsburgh at the time. I was on the ground for Tree of Life. I was part of the crisis response team, and I was there I was in Pittsburgh for 5 years total. I left to come to Miami about 2 years after the shooting and spent those 2 years on the crisis response team, which is still ongoing. So I walked through the police lines and watched the SWAT team exit the premises, and that was my first encounter with this whole situation. And many of the people you saw on the screen, I have close personal relationships with. I think that we were painfully aware, and this is I think it's a positive and a negative thing. We were painfully aware as a Jewish community once the dust started to settle after a few weeks, once we were really out of the triage mode, the crisis management mode, in the very worst sense, that there was going to be this window, and it wasn't going to be open forever, that people wanted to work with the Jewish community in Pittsburgh because of the thing that had just happened to us. And I think that's a very natural human reaction to want to show up after the fact. And I think when you mentioned, Rabbi, the relationships, we were able to respond. We were able to have 150 clergy on that stage that you saw in the film, because we were there for years and years and years before, building those relationships, having meaningful conversations. When Rabbi Myers mentioned Wasi Muhammad and the $250,000, that the Muslim community really through WASI was able to raise for us so quickly nationally. How did we facilitate those funds? It's because we're friends, because we were on the phone, because when this happened, he immediately knew who he could call. And so those relationships are so important. The second piece, and I'm gonna go political here. I don't think it's a controversial thing to say that we have been in an increasingly polarized society. You know, as we delve into politics and people shift further to the right or further to the left, I think whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, that becomes a part of your identity. Whether right or wrong, that's how people feel. And when we see extremism on either side, I think it's so important to have, again, the relationships that you mentioned. We don't get very far, or as far, when the left calls out the right for doing something wrong, or the right calls out the left. You get much farther when you're called out by your friends. Mm-hmm. And so if you are on the left and you lean in left circles, then you have to say to your friends on the left what you're doing is wrong. And if you're on the right, and it's the same thing. We have to be able to call out our friends and not just the people we disagree with.
Definitely. Paul, do you want to add anything, or should...
I mean,
the next question is for you, so.
Oh, okay, well, why don't you give me that one?
Okay, just also want to say this is a safe space to get political. We can get as political as we want here. Something else the film talked about a lot was this overlap between anti-Semitic discourse and anti-immigration rhetoric, racist rhetoric, right? We have to acknowledge that today is, marks the birth date of Dr. Martin Luther King. In the film, we saw him standing side by side with rabbis. It talked about the allyship between Black people and Jews based on understanding each other's struggles, right? So we can talk about that, but I also want to talk about this idea of a deeper racism and hatred for the other, the perceived other, and how that can show up in the Christian nationalism movement that's sort of spreading rapidly that you've talked about before. So I just want to give you the opportunity to talk about those connections, where it shows up, and then what we can do to combat this.
Well, yeah, thank you. We're very concerned about Christian nationalism in particular. Christian nationalism, if you want to connect the dots of what Christian nationalism is, it is connected with the Great Replacement theory, which you saw, which is connects this idea that the Jews are bringing in immigrants to make America less white, and this is not a new thing. It's the Great Replacement theory has been kind of around for about 100 years with the Ku Klux Klan and before that. And we have a sense of as people are using that rhetoric, which was specifically the rhetoric that the murderer in the Tree of Life used. And as was mentioned, one of the reasons that he wanted to target that particular synagogue was because they were so dedicated to helping refugees with support for HIAS and other organizations. But there is a broader sort of permission being getting political a little here is like, what is the rhetoric that we're hearing today? And it is incredibly telling that one of our likely candidates for the presidency has used terms like poisoning our bloodstream and the term vermin to talk about his opponents. And so, and it's there's certainly there should be a strong spotlight more on the left, which is where as well, but this kind of rhetoric is incredibly dangerous, and the idea that we are a Christian nation and everyone is here because there has been a toleration or barely a toleration of other faith traditions it's un-American, it is not represented in the Constitution, and it's also un-American at its core. And underlying kind of all of it, a through line is a racism of Christian nationalism. And so it does come together in these things, and you certainly saw it in most of the examples that were used in the film, certainly at Mother Emanuel, certainly at who also was a Christian nationalist, certainly in the Tree of Life, and in other places, and also in El Paso. So Christian nationalism is one of the through lines around this, but it is not the only one. And looking carefully at the language that is being used, and how we talk about one another is a really important caution for all of us to think about how language travels. And as long as do you mind if I tell one more story, as long as I have the mic?
Yeah, absolutely.
Before the Tree of Life shooting, one of the most deadly anti-Semitic acts that had taken place was actually against members of my family, the Goldmark family, that were living in Seattle. The Goldmarks had lived in Eastern Washington, had been a prominent family, had been attacked by the John Birch Society and others for being Jewish and communist, which there was Jewish background and communist. And that was in the 50s. 30 years later, one of the sons, Goldmark, it had been stirring around in kind of this echo chamber. This is before the internet, of right-wing hate groups. And on Christmas Day, some deranged person who had been affected by language went in and tied them all up and executed them. If you look up the Goldmarks the Goldmark family is, and so this devastation, this is language that people use that can create violence. And so we have to be very careful about language that we use and call it out when it happens.
Right, and we hear all the time, and the film kind of touched on this idea of, freedom of speech is protected under the First Amendment. I mean, hate speech is technically protected. And maybe it is time I think they raised this question in the film, but how do we stop that before it becomes a movement, a radicalization of one's ideals? Because as it is right now, put something hateful on the internet, it's completely protected. So, Josh, you want to speak on that?
So I think it's cultural, right? Well, first of all, I think a lot of people don't understand actually what the First Amendment is, right? You hear so many people say, well, this is my First Amendment right, and oftentimes they're not. You don't have a First Amendment right, for example, and I think this is the example most people know, to yell fire at a crowded theater, which is probably not the best analogy where we're sitting. But you can't say words that are proven to incite violence at a certain level, but it's really a protection of government, and it's really supposed to protect you from the government infringing on your rights. But I don't look at this First Amendment quote-unquote issue as a First Amendment issue. I look at it as a cultural issue, right? Because I do think that for the most part, one of the things that makes this country so great is that we all have the right to say whatever we want. What we have to remember is that I also have the right to call you a bigot if you're saying whatever you want. And as society becomes more, as the fringes become more mainstream, there's simply been less people speaking up and using their voice to call out extremism, and the echo chambers have become a reality for way too many people.
Absolutely. Rabbi, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, you go ahead.
No, it's good. I got it.
I'll just mention that is it's a really important question right now, especially around what kind of what kind of rights we have to say anything we want, especially on social media. I will say, like, again, my family has a skin in this game in that, like, Brandeis was, my great-grandfather Louis Brandeis was a great proponent of free speech.
I'm
And
a judge.
what's that?
I'm a Brandesian.
Sorry?
I'm a Brandesian.
Oh, she's a Brandesian. I didn't know that. Okay, so she probably knows more than I do. But I didn't go to law school, so I'm just going to like say what I do remember is that he was very interested in counter speech and that importance. But I do think right now we're in a moment with social media where social media is actually in financial duress, and they are laying off all people who were hired to be moderators of and to recognize this moment where people are actually crossing line between free speech to dangerous speech, and you don't actually have the right. I don't think you're going to tell me on a private platform or to say anything you want. And I think we have to be. We also have to be really like forthright in saying just because you may have the right. This is your point. You may have the right to say it, but you shouldn't say it. And like figuring out like how we can. How we can, those of us who do have microphones, can speak up when we have it.
Okay, so now I will address that a little bit. I think one of the problems with calling people out is that it's risky. And that people who have grown up, like I'm gonna look for my own children who grew up really very much in a positive Jewish environment in Miami where 98% of the time they never thought about any fear of being Jewish, but as young adults out in the world, there's a risk. There's a risk now if in an interview in a job interview, you're telling somebody that you're Jewish, what does that mean? Or if you're telling them that your father is Israeli, what does that mean? And I would say that a lot of people who spend a lot of time on social media, like young adults, have opted out recently. And instead of being the ones to call out, have been a little bit frightened, and they've done the opposite. They've turned off. They've shut down their sites. And so the reverberations of the extreme get louder and louder, and the feeling of being threatened and the feeling of being vulnerable from the extremes has silenced, unfortunately, many of the people who would say what is right and what is wrong.
Absolutely, this is a great conversation. I want to take it back to something else the film touched on a lot, which was this idea of maybe growing up and, as the young woman Peyton Klein put it, in a silo of acceptance and not really understanding the impact of anti-Semitism. And we know since this film was released, this problem of religiously motivated hate crimes has worsened. And they say this is a wake-up call for Holocaust educators, right? But I think it should also be a wake-up call for law enforcement and lawmakers, and in some ways I think it has. But Josh, I want to ask, what did your time in Pittsburgh teach you about the importance of community security? And you talked about this a little bit, partnerships with law enforcement when it comes to preventing this kind of violence.
I think there's so many ways, there's so many directions that we can take this in, right? I think relationships with law enforcement, and I hate to keep boiling this down to the same couple of points, but like it's just that, relationships. Mm-hmm. I think one of the tricky things about relationships with law enforcement, not for the Jewish community, but for other communities, right? There's so many diverse communities, there's so many minority communities, and all of them in different aspects have different relationships with different types of relationships with law enforcement over the years. And then there's cultural and language issues where, for example, I think a good example within the Jewish community is, we have a wide range of community leaders, community members from the unobservant all the way to the very Orthodox. Well, our Orthodox community, they're shutting off their phones for Shabbat. They're walking to synagogue, and if God forbid something like that, like what we just watched, happened in Miami or anywhere, Well, one of the things we have to think through with law enforcement is, how are we going to get a hold of the Orthodox community? One of the stories that isn't told in this documentary about Tree of Life, which happened on October 27th, was that 6 weeks earlier, Brad Orsini, who was the bald man driving the car, director of community security at the time, talking about what it must feel like to be Jewish, and he realized that after the shooting, he had trained the Tree of Life congregation on how to respond to an active shooter. So all of a sudden, Rabbi Myers, who was a conservative rabbi, was carrying his cell phone on Shabbat, was able to make a 911 call immediately. He and several other people in that congregation did know how to respond. We talk about 11 people who were murdered and 2 people who were wounded, and 4 law enforcement officers who were wounded rushing into the building. But what we don't talk about is how much worse that could have been if it weren't for that training. We don't talk about how, because of the relationships that we had with law enforcement in Pittsburgh, that they were there in less than 2 minutes, that the police, before the SWAT team arrived, engaged with him with their pistols and forced him back into the building. I think this is public information now. I haven't been following the trial maybe as closely, but he had plans to go to more than one synagogue that day. So the fact that they got there, that they forced him back into the building, that saved lives. And there's just this ongoing communication that the Jewish community has and continues to have with law enforcement, where I think we're really, really good at letting law enforcement know and then working with us to help keep us safe. The last thing that I'll share is I'm 39 years old. I have never, ever been to a synagogue service in my life, right? This is before October 7th, 2023. This is before October 27th, 2018. I have never been to a synagogue service where there hasn't been a police presence my entire life. And I think the Jews here, most Jews here will agree that they've had the same experience. Whether that's armed, uniformed officers outside the building, whether that's a police car parked outside, whether that is a police detail that's just making the rounds. I have never been able to worship in my life in the United States in what is supposed to, in what is the safest country and situation arguably for the Jewish community in our 5,000 years. I have not been able to worship without protection from law enforcement.
Rabbi, I wanted to ask this, kind of what I was getting at before. In your experience, what is a successful way to teach and talk about anti-Semitism with young people who might be growing up, in a silo of acceptance, or, especially right now? What is your experience? How do we talk to our young people about this?
Well, we have to really start early with identifying hate and identifying othering another person. And, we could really start with the idea of bullying and othering when children are very little, very, very young preschool children. And as children grow, they're able to acknowledge and learn more. Recently with my middle schoolers, we spend a lot of time on the pyramid of hate, which begins with bias and biased acts. Now they're familiar with that because they're in a school system or private schools or preschool and where we've always been talking about bias and othering. When you get to Holocaust Shoah education, really starts, it depends on where you are, if you're elementary school or middle school. And there's the understanding that as the Holocaust educator in the film said, it didn't just, that we say the Holocaust is 1933 to 1945, but anti-Semitism isn't. Anti-Semitism really started with the church, and that was the beginning. And so we have to keep remembering that you have to come at it from all sides, right? How they treat each other. What's the religious obligation of how you treat other people? What kind of kindness are you going to do, and are you going to be a helpful person or a hateful person? And this has to be drilled and practiced and experienced always. And then later you get to the serious Holocaust education. We've recently had a multi-generational trip to Poland, and I participated a few times with the March of the Living, which goes to Poland and camps, and then to Israel. And so it has to just, as most education, spiraling up and up and up, so we can keep the ideas going. But it really starts with what's an other.
Something I found really inspiring in the film was when the young girl, Peyton Klein, talked about how to create inclusive spaces and exclusive spaces. And as a former high school teacher, I just thought that was so amazing to see, because I think we forget how permanent high school can feel and how serious it is for a lot of people, especially, when she talks about the Muslim girl and her experience wearing a hijab and maybe being identified as someone who's not a part of the mainstream religion or culture can be really, really difficult. And I was going to ask, what can we teach our younger generation about creating inclusive spaces? But I think a better question is and Paul, maybe you can take this one, what can we learn from the younger generation about how to acknowledge and celebrate people's differences and, without fear of being mocked or hated for it, and creating inclusive spaces?
Exception on the screen.
Well, I think if we, one of the important attributes of younger people I worked at Princeton University for 8 years, and I have nieces and nephews, and I do think that they're willing to ask questions and be curious in a way that I think I'm not even sure I knew enough to be curious about. Like, I think they are just aware right now enough to really know, like, can I ask you about this? And I think that's perhaps the most important thing we can do right now. We're in a moment where there is a great deal of, I would say, people are very hesitant and nervous about asking questions because of October 7th, because of what happened afterwards. It's a very difficult time. In my 30 years of interfaith work, this is probably the most difficult time. I think the best of what we're seeing right now are relationships that have endured and are enduring because people are refusing to break off relationships with one another. And they're doing it in ways that have been cultivated. Like, the universities that are doing best right now are ones that have cultivated some sort of inoculation against this moment of deep suspicion, and we have to be honest about that right now. It's very difficult. However, there are good places and good people who are reaching out, and in some ways, like, teaching the discipline of empathy right now as much as possible. Like, how do we really ask people how they're feeling, and how do we really listen and find ways to show up for one another in our pain? Because the truth is, right now, even before October 7th, anti-Semitism was at a height it hadn't been seen in decades. And the same thing is true of hatred and violence against the Muslim community and the Black community. We are at a record high, terrible moment. So how do we recognize that these various communities that feel at odds are actually experiencing some similar painful moments? And how do one of the things that my organization has done, and I want to acknowledge Maureen O'Leary here, who's our director of field and organizing, who's been a leader in this, is that we're trying to encourage our leaders across the country to continue to pledge to show up for one another in their pain, and figure out ways to hold space for one another. And that can be, that can be done in public, but sometimes it can be done in private. But I offer that as like, young people, I think, are, they do have wisdom, but I've also heard from some of my nieces, my niece who is at university right now, that people have knives out, and that the knives are on all sides, and they're stopping people from embracing one another.
Wow.
And it's a very hard moment. So I just want to acknowledge that as well, and people feel very strongly about it.
Right.
But now is the moment that the interfaith movement was made for. Now is the moment that the civil rights movement was made for. Look, how could we show up for one another? And also recognize that we are in a moment where, people are publicly using language that Hitler used, and we have to recognize that this is not going to go away, and it's actually, we're in a terrible, terrifically important time for our democracy, and we have to show up for one another.
Really well said, thank you. Does anyone else want to add to that question? Yeah, and I also I think that's a great point you make about, what's happening on college campuses also. It's not all safe spaces and inclusivity. Like, there are, exclusive groups that form, and, we've seen that recently. And another thing we've seen a lot in Florida recently, speaking of politics, is laws that sort of demonize the word diversity, DEI, and from the language of some of the bills, protect the feelings of white people who might feel uncomfortable learning about histories of minority groups, of gay people, black people, etc. How do we push back on those things? Like, where does that come into the conversation? And do we feel that people in Florida really agree with this thinking? In your experience, who wants to take that one? Josh?
I don't even know where to start.
Okay.
So part of my role is government relations, right? And we're kind of at these. No, I don't think most people in Florida agree with that, and I think that most of the legislators in Tallahassee don't agree with it, on both sides of the aisle. And I can say that through personal conversations. I think that there are certain brands and certain dollars and certain people pushing certain agendas at play that make for talking points for some legislators who may be seeking higher office. And but no, I firmly believe that more than half of our legislature, and I say that recognizing that both our House and our Senate in this state is a supermajority, I firmly believe that the majority of them don't agree with that legislation. I think it's also sometimes really, one of the programs that we run is at Jewish Federation is a partnership with the NAACP, where we bring about a dozen Black and Jewish teens together over the course of 4 months, and we talk about identity, and we talk about building coalitions, and we talk about issues they care about, and we talk about how to create change, and then they work together. And these are teens who, for the most part, wouldn't ordinarily meet each other, and we culminate, and it's actually in next week. We take them to Tallahassee for the day, and we teach them to advocate. I was sitting with the teens in a session last week, and they were telling me that their teachers literally cannot say gay, which, say what you want about the bill, I thought don't say gay was a great talking point. I didn't know it was actually true. That the teacher can only use the word homosexual. And I was just astounded by this, and I don't really have a solution. I'm not really answering your question. I'm just sharing a story.
What's the solution?
Yeah.
Because of fear of retaliation.
There's fear of retaliation. There's fear of legal chaos. Some of these laws have been implemented so quickly that lawyers don't have time to review them, to give the institutions adequate guidance on how to best implement them. So it creates kind of a freeze across, for example, the school system, because they don't know whether you agree or disagree with the legislation. You don't know what you can teach and keep your job.
Right.
So talking about the students that on college campuses before, I don't want to go on too long, and I don't know what to do. I can talk about the problem, but I don't have a good answer, so I'm going to stop.
You're doing a great job. Does anyone else want to? I mean, we can move away from the political discourse a little bit, and I have maybe one more question before we open it up to audience. And Rabbi, I just want to ask you, and I want to end on this. At the end of the film, we learned a little bit about the Jewish teaching of Tikkun Olam. Did I say that right?
Yeah.
And about how to repair the world before we leave it. Can you talk about what this means for you, for Jews right now in Miami, and how to interpret this concept through the lens of tragedy?
October 5th, I'd have one answer.
Sure, yeah.
And whatever day today is, it's a much more difficult question. But the broad answer is that Tikkun Olam is a commitment to repair the world. The idea comes from a couple of places. One from the Kabbalists thinking that when God created the world, there was so much God, it was almost like a glass shattering. And all those shards from our good actions and the good work that we do brings that world back together. And that's one of our goals. And I think was Rabbi said, we're obligated to keep the work going, even though we're not obligated to do it forever. It's from Pirkei Avot, Ethics of Our Ancestors. And that really is a big guiding principle, that we're not living in this world in a vacuum, and that God created all of humanity in the image of God, and therefore we need to uphold that principle. And so that's the work that we try to do. Sometimes, like now, the idea of repairing the world seems very big, and we just have to focus. I was at the role model, the 5,000 role models breakfast this morning, and I was sitting with the Consul General for Israel, and you don't say to him, "How are you?" I say, "How are you holding up?" And he's like, "That's right, it's how we're holding up." And so repair the world is big, and at the same time, we can't desist from that work. So it always has to be in our minds, like, what can we do next to move in a more positive direction? What can we do next? And programs like this, programs like we have the synagogue from JCRC, from Interfaith Alliance, those are the things that move us a little bit forward. And so now we may be moving slower in the Jewish community because it's more than scary out there. I would say in a time when we really needed allyship, we don't feel like we have allies. Present company excluded, of course. We don't feel like we have allies, and we feel like the people that we have been allies with are not showing up for us. And I was recently at a conference, and Paul was saying, show up even in pain, and I was listening to so many other rabbis share their stories, how the people that they showed up for and the people that they thought would show up with them at this time have completely disappeared and have left them alone. So on the one hand, we are always committed to repairing the world and the idea that we need to make this world a better place. And on the other hand, we don't want to be the only ones involved in this work.
Right. Absolutely. You want to add to that, Josh? I can tell you have thoughts.
Yeah, I do have thoughts, but yeah, it's really been, in terms of repairing the world, it's been incredibly different, and I think eye-opening. And I've watched this film twice today. I watched this morning in preparation for the panel, and then I watched it here. And I couldn't help think about some of the similarities and the differences between October 27th in the film and October 7th, and how I personally have been feeling as a Jewish person. When you're sitting in Pittsburgh, in a city, in your community, and the worst thing that you can possibly imagine happens, everybody comes together. There's nobody in Pittsburgh can deny that happened. Everybody in Pittsburgh can see the ripple effects on that community, to the point where I'll even share that as a Jewish person, when I moved down to Miami and I talk about Tree of Life, it's different, because even when I talk to the Jewish community here, we all understand what it's like to experience anti-Semitism. If you're not Jewish, whether you are or you're not Jewish, if you're not a Pittsburgher, you don't get that at your core. You just don't, because it's not your community. At the same time, when October 7th happened, and 1,200 Jews were murdered by people who just wanted to murder Jews, the emotional toll that I see on the Jewish community worldwide and across communities is worse on October 27, 2023 than it was affected by the shooting that we all just watched. And it's because I think that we as Jews have this innate sense that what happened here now just happened to us 5 years later on a global scale. But it happened halfway around the world, where nobody in the United States, right, that really understands, if we're not Jewish, how we're feeling or what it's like to be attacked by someone like that. This riot that we saw is what our grandparents and our great-grandparents remember, not us. But at my core, it's the same feeling, and it's there is not a single, I'll close with this, there's not a single Jewish person in the world, and I mean this, in the world, who in the weeks after October 7th didn't have at least one of the following: a friend or a close family member who was in a bomb shelter lying on the floor for more hours a day than not, who was on the front lines or called up to reserve duty in fighting either in Israel or Gaza and their life was on the line, a person who was injured and in the hospital, or a person who was injured or missing, who was taken hostage. Every single one of us knows at least one of the four, and it's because the Jewish community there's only 15 or 20 million of us. There aren't that many, and it's a small, close community, and I think that people just don't know. They don't understand because they don't know.
Thank you so much for sharing that and articulating it the way that you just did. So important. Does anybody in the audience have any questions for our panelists? Thoughts about the film? Yeah, right here.
You said that it's hard after October 27 to get support, or people you used to be friends with show up at events such as this, for example. What is on the other hand, the attitude, the feeling of the Jewish community towards the Muslim community at large after October 27? Has there been any change?
Yeah, So October. So it's October. So October 27th was the shooting, and October 7th was the attack on Israel. It's okay. Yeah. I don't think. So I want to distinguish, right? There's the Muslim community, and then there's Hamas, right? For me, at my core, and there is nothing that anybody in the world will get me to change. Like, the Palestinian people are suffering, and there have been an incredible amount of death and sadness in Gaza, and like that needs to be acknowledged. I, at my core, blame Hamas, the terrorist organization who runs Gaza, who has taken the aid and supplies for themselves, who is. The people in Hamas, the terrorist organization, are the same people who cheered in the streets on September 11, 2001. And so, as a Jew, recognizing the problems in Israel, some of the racism in Israel, I don't, at my core, I can't look at people who infiltrated Israel's border, murdered 1,200 Jews, and then people point the finger at Israel and say, it's Israel's fault. I mean, the best analogy that I heard is when you talk about sexual assault to a woman and someone says, well, what was she wearing? Yeah. I mean, it's so incredibly similar. So I say that to say that the Jewish community, Rabbi, I don't know if you have anything to add. It's like, we've shrunk our allyships. We're much less trusting. It's not just the Muslim community. It's everybody. Like, our walls are up. So we have tons of friends who aren't Jewish, whether they're, black, white, Latin, LGBTQ, Muslim, South Asian, Asian. It's just harder to be outside of the community. And so I think that attitude is reflected towards everybody. And there's just a tremendous fear.
Josh really expressed that well. First of all, I don't think any of us really can speak for the whole Jewish community reflecting on a whole worldwide Muslim community. I do know that we hold Hamas responsible and the leaders in Gaza. And no one's going to be able to say that is not what happened. And when people can't understand what's morality of coming in and shooting through a mother into her baby, who she's trying to protect, and trying to give any reason that that's okay, when Gaza was ruled by vote by Hamas, that's what's happening. Certainly, no one wants to ignore the suffering and pain of innocent people.
So did that answer the question about the Muslim community and Jewish community, for the most part?
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions? Thoughts? Sir?
I'd like to ask Josh, and I think I know the answer. Do you think that if there was a similar situation here in Miami or South Florida, an attack on a synagogue or a mosque, would Miamians come together today?
So,
Yeah.
the question is...
Okay, sorry. So if there was a similar attack in Miami on a synagogue or a mosque that there was in Pittsburgh, would Miami? Yeah, yes. Would we come together? I think absolutely.
You really do?
I really
Yeah.
do. I will say Pittsburgh is incredibly unique and close in a way. I think it's hard to set an example like Pittsburgh did, but I do think that Miamians would come together. Miami's also a much bigger place, for better or worse. I do believe that we would come together.
But for instance, they couldn't have those discussions in a high school, in a public high school.
Why not?
Which one?
You think you could have a discussion at Palmetto High School, which is close to Beth Am,
Right.
about anti-Semitism today? I think the answer is absolutely not.
A discussion? Like an educational discussion?
You can't talk about anything that makes white people feel uncomfortable.
But there are standards in the curriculum for Holocaust education.
One of the
right?
bills that actually were
I would love to hear.
one of the bills, and one of the bills that we're lobbying for, our teams are lobbying for in Tallahassee next week, and I think it's going to pass, is better Holocaust education and African American history education in our public schools. I don't want to. I see the point you're trying to make, and I don't, and it's an important one, but I don't want to conflate mourning the murder of innocent worshipers, whatever religion they are, with conversations about diversity. I think what you're saying is maybe we can't talk about the cause in a way in which you're most comfortable with, but I think that showing up for each other in that moment is I absolutely think we would, and I who's to say what might happen next, but yeah.
That's a good distinction.
Yeah. Okay. One last question over here, sir.
Thank you for the opportunity. My name's Herald Ford, Josh. I don't know if you remember me, but I'm one of the associates at Sweet Home Missionary Baptist Church.
Yeah, I saw your face, and I recognized you, and I couldn't place you. Thank you very much.
And I'm also the president of the South Bay branch of the NACP. And I encourage education as one of the things that's going to help carry both of our communities through these types of circumstances. What you've articulated earlier about how the Jewish people feel as far as guards up, that's what black people have felt in America for centuries. Because of the various attacks that have transpired that were actually legal at one time, because when you had mobs going and burning down various communities, nobody was held to account for it. But my question here now, and I would love to hear each of you, and I don't know how much time we got, but you all can worry about that piece, is what is the path forward? What is the path forward? Because at the end of the day, black people are not as trusting. Jewish people now, who you hear, are even less trusting now because of circumstances that have transpired, not just abroad, but here in the United States. And like I said, historically, I know, when I look at the NACP, 1909, it was started in partnership with people of the Jewish faith, as well as other communities, along with black people. Then we go to what happened after or during World War II, when the Jewish community was fleeing, and here, where many Jewish people were hired and employed at historically black colleges and universities. And so now we're here again. We've had this, this up and down type of relationship where there's a lot of interconnectivity, but trying to figure out that path forward, because I know education is going to be one of the keys, but will it unlock everything in totality? So I would love to hear as to what we can do to, one, not only just repair our respective communities, but to enjoin so that we can do the things that are necessary to move our societies as well as the global society forward.
It's a great question. Great points. Thank you.
I think it's really important, just coming as an interfaith leader, of just to be honest about a lot of the history of the interfaith movement, which has really centered white people and white relationships. And I think that at the same time, there has always been an opportunity to deepen relationships and go deeper within the Black Christian, the Black Muslim, and increasingly Black Jewish community, that recognizing diversity within our communities. And so, like, within, you know, my expertise, if I have one, is within interfaith work, and recognizing the rich resources within different religious traditions that actually have increasingly more diverse leadership. And some of the most very powerful leaders within the Jewish community that I have the privilege to work with are from African American tradition, Asian, and other tradition. And so there's an opportunity there, but across the board. And I think the more we can acknowledge the diversity within our religious traditions, bring that into interfaith organizing, which is really, and especially recognize the bring to the fore the specific concerns of Black Americans. I think that will be very important. It's not enough about relationships. It's also like, how will we show up politically for one another, and recognize that, you know, how do we bring in questions around racial equity, but also voting rights, suppression, the things that, you know, making sure that our policy organizing, which my organization does a lot of policy work around religious minorities and other things, LGBTQ and others, but also how does our policy organizing invite leadership, and also showing up for Black priorities. And I think that's how coalitions get really, really solid, is that you allow agendas to be set and showing up for people in real ways, whether that's the voting booth or other ways. So I think that it's important that we do show up and offer solace to one another. Even more importantly, how do we show up for one another in policy work?
I'll just add, I think that certainly for the Reform Jewish movement, advocacy and policy is extremely important, and something that we work with all the time. And we come to it from a position of faith, from a position of, as I said, humanity being created in God's image, and our role as human beings towards other human beings. So from that position of faith, we come to the idea that advocacy and equity and even speaking up politically is one of our obligations. Friday, I'm taking 24 kids to DC for what we Reform Movement's Religious Action Center, where Civil Rights Act was partly scripted there, and because we have to teach advocacy, we have to teach the power of the voice, and that everybody's voice has to be heard, and sometimes protected, and always lifted up. It's from for us, it's from a core of faith, but it's ongoing, and it's forever, and it's hard work. As a child, my parents were very involved in the NAACP, and I'm 60, and there's been a lot of things that have changed, and a lot of things that haven't.
I'm gonna lean on putting nuance back into the conversation. One of the things I think about going back to October 27th is Wasi, who someone I've known for years and someone I got to know really well. And Wasley is a tremendous Muslim leader who, because of who he is as a person, single-handedly, I shouldn't say single-handedly, but like on the forefront of the Muslim side, strengthened Jewish and Muslim relationships in Pittsburgh before October 27, 2018, to a height that didn't exist for decades, and since he's moved on to other roles, aren't there now. And I love Wasi. He will be. I don't talk to him regularly, but he will be a friend until he's a hero to me. And now, currently, he is the chief of staff for one of the most left-leaning congresswomen in the United States, who, on a good day, puts Hamas and Israel, counts them as equals. And, I mean, the only other person the second most responsible person for that is Wasi. But I know him well enough to know, and it breaks my heart. But I also know him well enough to know that he doesn't have an anti-Semitic bone in his body. And I think that when we're coming to the table to do this work, that if we took a second to have the nuance and to see the whole person, because if I was just in this space and moving to Pittsburgh now and just getting to know him now, I would just see him as a problem. And he's not only not a problem, he's a friend.
Thank you for that, for all of those answers. I know the question wasn't for me, but I wanted to take this opportunity to highlight a group that I wrote about a couple months ago called Pact Miami. They're a great, they're a coalition of over 40 congregations in Miami-Dade, and they work together towards solutions, policy-based solutions, advocacy work. And through my time reporting on this group, I saw how they show up for each other. They meet in various congregations, houses of worship, so they learn about each other's religions, and with the common goal of making Miami-Dade a better place for everyone. So I just want to uplift that organization.
Could you say the name again?
It's PACT, which stands for People Acting for Community Together, PACT.
Thank you. We're 5 minutes.
Okay. All right, well, I think we've touched on everything. Any last words, any last thoughts from our panelists? From anyone in the audience who didn't get to ask a question? If not, we're going to wrap up. Oh, sorry.
No, I'll just say thank you for your moderation.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you thank you to Matt for bringing us together.
Thank you, Matt Anderson.
Thank you for this theater. I know we didn't pack the house, but it's just thank you for this initiative. It's so important.
Yeah.
And I think it's just going to be a really asset to Miami. So we're very, very appreciative to be here.
Thank you, Mosaic. Thank you, Interfaith Alliance. And thank you to my panelists for being amazing.
Thank you.
Thank you guys for sticking around. We really appreciate it.